Okay, before we start on the esophagus and stomach, we better do a little bit with the pharynx. I'll leave that out. In my diagram that I have here on the board, we have the nose up here, the nasal opening here, so we'll deal with those things when we talk about the respiratory system. Here we have the oral cavity. We've just been talking about the oral cavity. This is this area in through here. Here's the tongue sitting right in here. And right about right there would be the level of your palatoglossal arches. So we've got that opening we call the fauces that allowed food to move from your mouth into your pharynx, located about right there. So your pharynx is back in here. The pharynx extends up above your soft palate to a point, and if you remember where your vomer is in your skull, that separation, that nasal septum extends back to the back of that vomer, and that line right there represents the vomer, the end of the vomer. So in front of that would be nasal passages, left and right. Behind that, this is part of the pharynx. The pharynx also includes everything down to the esophagus, and the esophagus would end about right there. This opening right here into the windpipe, right there, would be a separate space, so we're going to make another line there. So this space right through here represents our pharynx. Now we divide the pharynx into different regions. We can identify an area above the soft palate that we usually don't see when you look in the back of your mouth because it's up above in the soft palate, above the soft palate. And we refer to that as the nasopharynx. Nasopharynx. Below that right in here is the area you see when you open up your mouth and say, ah, it goes down to about this point right there. We refer to this as the oropharynx. And then down a little bit lower near the opening to your windpipe right in here, this region is referred to as the laryngopharynx. So we have nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, the three pharyngeal regions. Now let's talk a little bit about what we find in those areas. There's a small opening to your eustachian tube up here in the top of your nasopharynx, a tiny little tube that connects between your middle ear space and there behind your eardrum to the pharynx. That little opening right there would be the opening to the eustachian tube. Also up in your nasopharynx are some special tissues. Let's see. Some of your tonsils are up in here. These are your adenoids, sometimes called pharyngeal tonsils. The adenoids. In your oropharynx, immediately behind your palatoglossal arch on both sides, you have your larger tonsils in there, what we know as palatine tonsils. So there's our palatine tonsil. Also in the base of your tongue, though we don't usually talk much about it, there's a tonsillar arrangement right here in the base of your tongue. It's not really out in your pharyngeal space. It's really behind, down beyond the tissue wall in there. But anyway, right in there is your lingual tonsil. So just to make sure we identify our tonsil types, even though it's not really in the pharynx, that's where our lingual tonsil is, the base of our tongue. Down here in the laryngopharynx, one important thing we want to recognize is this flap that sticks up right through here, right in there. There's a special cartilage piece right there we refer to as the epiglottis. The epiglottis. Where can I label that? epiglottis, epiglottis, the epiglottis. This cartilage piece, it helps to cover the opening to the windpipe when you swallow. Now, one misconception is that it flops down and back up again when you swallow. It doesn't happen that way. What happens is the laryngeal cartilages and these structures in here in the upper part of your respiratory system, when you swallow, they are pulled up, and you can actually feel those when you swallow move up in your throat. So they are pushed up, and as they get pushed up, they push up against that epiglottis plate there. So the epiglottis stays kind of in position, is kind of pushed this direction, moved up that way, as these are pushed up against it, and that closes that opening right there. That opening, let's see what we can do with that. There's an opening right there. Let's make it in black. This opening right here, the opening to what we call the windpipe, or the respiratory tract down here, lower respiratory tract, right there, is referred to as the glottis, Glottis. So the epiglottis is above the opening, the glottis opening. So down in this area here, you're going to have your larynx, the very first part of your windpipe there, and then the digestive tube continues this way. This part right here is the esophagus. So a lot written on there, but you need to know the three regions of your pharynx: nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, and how you would describe where those are. And you need to know what features are associated with each of the three regions. So in your nasopharynx, you have your opening to your eustachian tubes and your adenoids up in there. In your oropharynx, you're going to see your palatine tonsils back there behind the palatoglossal arch. Down in your laryngopharynx, you have your epiglottis that kind of sticks out in there, and the glottis opening to your larynx. Now we're ready to talk about esophagus and stomach. I'll make this a little thicker right here so it shows up a little better. This is the esophagus right here, connecting between the pharynx and the stomach. So it's just a tube that runs through here. And I failed to mention when we were talking about the pharynx, the functions there. For the oral cavity, we mentioned that we had both mechanical digestion with chewing and manipulating the food with our tongue and so forth. It's part of the digestion, but also chemical digestion was happening with the addition of enzymes, salivary enzymes. In the pharynx, not much is going on in terms of chemical digestion. The saliva still works on it that it was produced in the oral cavity, but basically all we do with the pharynx is we have a reflex action that pushes the food down into the esophagus. And we call that swallowing, right? It's just, we have a voluntary part of swallowing where we move the food to our pharynx, and then the pharynx takes over with a reflex reaction that pushes the food down into the esophagus. The esophagus is just a tube that conducts the food from the pharynx to the stomach. It does not add any enzymes, any fluids. It simply carries the food from one place to another. And it does that by a process we call peristalsis, and we'll talk more about peristalsis in a little bit. At the lower end of the esophagus, there is a sphincter muscle, a circular muscle that helps to constrict right here. And at the lower end of the stomach right here, there's another type of sphincter muscle. And we'll talk about those later as well. So here's the esophagus. This is stomach. And here's our small intestine. The first part of our small intestine is the duodenum. So that's the duodenum right there. All right, in this drawing we have here, this is a cross section, well, it's actually a longitudinal cut, a section through the esophagus. And the esophagus has the central tube space and then all the layers of the esophageal wall. First off, in the very middle, this cavity within the esophagus we refer to as a lumen, L-U-M-E-N. That's a rather generic term for any cavity within an organ or a vessel. That space inside is referred to as a lumen. So here's the lumen of the esophagus. The layers of the wall are organized into 4 different zones. The first zone being called a mucosa. So in the mucosal zone, we have 3 sublayers. The first sublayer of the mucosa is the epithelial layer. So you have a layer of epithelium, and you'll recall that the epithelium that's found in the esophagus is a stratified squamous epithelium. Remember, there are layers of cells. They start out more rounded, and as they go toward the surface, they're flattened. These are non-keratinized. These are like the epithelial cells you would find inside your oral cavity, in your cheeks and along your gum line and so forth. So we have that stratified squamous epithelium, not keratinized, making up the first layer of our mucosa. The next layer in here is a layer of loose connective tissue, and this layer of loose connective tissue here is referred to as a lamina propria. The lamina propria. Wherever you find mucosal membranes inside the body that have an epithelium, and then the next layer next to that epithelium is going to be a loose connective tissue called the lamina propria. So that's a layer of loose connective tissue, the lamina propria. The next layer out is a thin layer of smooth muscle. And this smooth muscle is referred to as the muscularis mucosa. So those 3 layers together make up the one layer we refer to as the mucosa. Next to that, in this green color right here, that layer right there, is a zone we call the submucosa. That is a dense, irregular connective tissue. Dense, irregular connective tissue similar to that deeper layer of your dermis, the submucosa. Beyond that, I better label that down here as well, right? Submucosa is the second layer. And that's a dense, irregular connective tissue. The next layer out, the third layer here, is called the muscularis externa. Muscularis externa. And it has 2 different layers of smooth muscle. Well, 2 layers of muscle, I should say. In the esophagus, you have a transition from skeletal muscle, as you find in your pharynx, to a smooth muscle at the very lower end. So all of this muscularis externa transitions from skeletal muscle in the upper esophagus to smooth muscle in the lower esophagus. So there's just kind of a gradual transition from one muscle type to the other. But there are 2 layers of the muscularis externa. There's an inner circular layer, of the muscularis externa, and then there's an outer longitudinal layer. The inner circular layer goes around the circumference, and the longitudinal runs up and down the esophagus. The very last layer on the outside is another smooth muscle layer. It also contains some nerves and blood vessels and so forth, but it's loose connective tissue, and it's referred to as the adventitia. Again, a loose connective tissue. The light green represents loose connective tissue. The darker green, the dense, irregular connective tissue. The orange is muscle, the muscularis mucosa lying through here, and then the 2 layers of muscle, the muscularis circular layer of muscularis externa, and then the longitudinal layer of the muscularis mucosa. So those are the layers of the esophageal wall. We'll talk more about these muscle layers when we talk about peristalsis here in a minute. Now let's think about what this would be like if we were making a cross section, cutting through this and looking on it, on that tissue on the end there. So I've just adjusted my camera a little bit. We're going to make a drawing that represents what we see in a cross section of the esophagus. So if you're ready to cut through it, the first layer would be that epithelial layer around the lumen. Now in life, the cross section would have deep folds in it, so it wouldn't have this large open space. It's kind of closed up from all the folds that come together in the esophagus. But anyway, there's your epithelial layer. The second layer then would be the loose connective tissue to the outside of that. That's that lamina propria. The lamina propria beneath the stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium. So that's the second layer of the mucosa. The third layer of the mucosa being that muscularis mucosa, very thin layer of smooth muscle that's arranged to the outside of the lamina propria. So those three layers make up the mucosa of the esophagus. Next to that, we have the submucosal layer. So we have a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue between the muscularis mucosa and the muscularis externa. So this is the second layer of the esophagus. And mucosa, next is submucosa. Next we have the muscularis externa. Muscularis externa. So we have an inner circular layer. It's fairly thick. So all of that represents the inner circular layer right here. So we have the muscle cells arranged in a circle. Inner circular layer of muscle, and the muscularis externa. And then outside of that, we have the second layer of the muscularis externa. And here, this is longitudinal. These are running up and down the length of the esophagus. I'll put little dots in here to represent the longitudinal portion. So we're seeing it in cross section now. So we're cutting across those muscle fibers or muscle cells as we go through there. And then finally, on the very outside, we have this adventitial layer of loose connective tissue, the fourth major layer of our esophageal wall. This adventitia will lie next to other tissues of the mediastinum. Notably, the trachea would be along one side over here, and other structures and organs around other parts of that esophagus. So, in the middle we have the lumen. We have three layers to the mucosa. The three layers were the epithelium, the lamina propria, and muscularis mucosa. The next layer out from that is submucosa. It's that dense, irregular connective tissue. The next layer out from that is muscularis externa. Consists of the inner circular layer and outer longitudinal layer, and then on the very outside we have adventitia. Adventitia. In these two images, we're going to talk about the peristaltic activity of the esophagus, moving food down the esophagus, keeping it from getting stuck in there. We're going to keep our food passage open. So the first example just shows what we were looking at last time, just an empty esophagus with our layers. We had the epithelium, the loose connective tissue, and muscularis mucosa making up the mucosal layer, then the green layer right there representing the submucosa, and then we have our muscularis externa, the inner circular layer and the outer longitudinal layers of muscle in the muscularis externa. Those are the muscle layers that are going to be important in pushing our food through our esophagus in this peristaltic wave. The way this works is any food material that's in here, so there'd be a food mass, something you swallowed right in here. It stimulates the peristaltic wave, and what happens is we have a contraction of our longitudinal muscle right here. So it kind of bunches up right here where the food is, and it crunches the outer wall a little bit, and that process kind of makes this lumen, this cavity, more open as we constrict that. So it scrunches up the portion of the esophagus right there. That scrunching motion travels down the esophagus. So it starts at the top and travels downward. Immediately following that is a contractile wave that is right here that causes a constriction of the esophagus above that bunching up portion of the peristaltic wave. So this forms kind of a stripping action following that bunching up that's traveling down the esophagus there. So you have this wave of contraction of the outer longitudinal muscle followed immediately by a constriction of that circular muscle that helps to propel food down the esophagus. So you have a longitudinal muscle constriction followed by circular muscle constriction moving through that peristaltic wave. Now we had movement of food through that peristaltic action in the esophagus. Here we have a place of entry into the stomach, the lower end of the esophagus, and we mentioned that right in through here we have a constrictor muscle, a sphincter muscle, at the top of the stomach between the esophagus and the stomach. This is usually referred to as the cardiac sphincter. Between the esophagus and stomach. Down at the other end of the stomach, there's also a muscle here that restricts movement of food out of the stomach and into the intestine. This sphincter here is the pyloric sphincter. The stomach is divided into different regions. That region near the cardiac sphincter we refer to as the cardia or cardiac region of the stomach. This region that pushes up against the diaphragm over on this side, this is referred to as the fundus or fundic region of the stomach. Fundus. Down here at the lower end, near the pyloric sphincter, this narrowed portion through here is often referred to as the pylorus or the pyloric region of the stomach. The remainder through the middle of the stomach here is simply referred to as the body of the stomach. Inside the stomach, the mucosa is thrown into folds that make ridges, longitudinal ridges that start up near the top of the stomach and they kind of extend down along here. So this would be a fold in the wall of the stomach, leading down to the pyloric region. So there are several of these folds of the mucosa on the wall of the stomach between the top and the bottom. Very obvious and visible when you open up the stomach and look inside. You'll see these mucosal folds, and these are referred to as rugae. A single one is a ruga. You put an E at the end of it to plural of the word ruga, right? Now there's a membrane that attaches to this, a mesentery membrane, that extends off of this side of the stomach, makes a large fold within the abdominal cavity, and this large fold is referred to as the greater omentum. So the greater omentum is attached to this side of the stomach. So this is our greater omentum. Over here, and we refer to this part of the stomach out here where the greater omentum is attached as the greater curvature. The greater curvature. Over here on this side, you notice there's a smaller curve. This is the lesser curvature. On the lesser curvature, over here we have another membrane. This membrane extends from the stomach to the liver. So between the stomach and the liver, we have a lesser omentum. A lesser omentum. Lesser omentum and the lesser curvature, greater omentum associated with the greater curvature. So those are the anatomical regions. You should know which sphincter is where and what the different regions of the stomach are called, and that there's a membrane of tissue that extends out away from the greater curvature, called the greater omentum, and then another between the stomach and the liver, called the lesser omentum. Before I go too far with the histological composition of the stomach, we want to talk about the stomach lining, the cells of the stomach lining. The lumen of the stomach would be up here, the cavity of the stomach where the food mixes around. And then the wall of the stomach is made up of columnar epithelial cells, and here we have columnar epithelial cells right along here and right along here. And they form these long glands, long tubular passages that extend into the mucosa of the stomach wall. So here we have a gastric gland, here's another gastric gland, here's a third gastric gland in the stomach lining. Between these glands there will be little bits of loose connective tissue, parts of the lamina propria, and our muscularis mucosa, the final layer of our mucosal layer, will be right along here. Beyond that will be our submucosa muscularis externa, and then the serosal membrane. But we want to talk about the cell types that are found associated with the stomach lining first. These cells that are found adjacent to the lumen, this space out here, are called surface mucus cells. Surface mucus cells. And they produce a lot of mucus to form a nice coating or lining on the stomach here to protect your stomach lining. As you head down into these spaces right here, this is referred to as a gastric pit. It's a funnel-like opening to that gland that extends down here. So as we go down the gland right here, these cells found along the next section down in here, these are called mucous neck cells. Mucous neck cells. Also mucus producing, but not as tall or don't produce quite as much mucus as those surface mucus cells or smaller mucus cells. As you go down in the gastric gland a little bit further, you pick up another kind of cell, and we're showing them here with these little orange circles in there. These are called parietal cells. They produce hydrochloric acid, or HCl. Hydrochloric acid produced by parietal cells. And then at the very bottom, toward the very bottom of your gastric glands in the blue, these cells represented in here, these are what we call chief cells. Chief cells. These produce an enzyme called pepsinogen. Actually, it's a precursor to the enzyme pepsin. Pepsinogen is produced by chief cells. So we're going to show here in a minute what's going on with the secretion of this pepsinogen and the hydrochloric acid. This pepsinogen is an inactive form of a protein digesting enzyme. So it's secreted in an inactive form and it moves up through here. The hydrochloric acid activates the pepsinogen or changes the pepsinogen into the active enzyme pepsin. So we don't want an active enzyme digesting our tissues there, so it's important that we have a mucus lining protecting our stomach wall. And so we have all these mucous neck cells and surface mucus cells at the top. So inactive enzyme here becomes activated as it moves up through the tube and released into the stomach. Now we're going to add more tissues to this stomach wall. Now that we know what the stomach lining, the epithelial lining is like, in between the gastric glands we have a number, well, we have quite a bit of loose connective tissue, lymphocytes, blood vessels, even some smooth muscle cells mixed in there. So this is the lamina propria, this loose connective tissue layer in here. Adjacent to that loose connective tissue and the base of these glands right in here, we have a layer of smooth muscle. That's your muscularis mucosa, right along there. Beyond that, we have the submucosal layers, dense irregular connective tissue, the submucosa. Beyond that, we have the muscularis externa. The muscularis externa has 3 layers in the stomach. The innermost layer is what we call the oblique layer. The second one would be the circular layer, and then the outer is the longitudinal layer. So we have 3 layers here. I'll go ahead and put dotted lines in the circular layer, and some stripes in the longitudinal layer. That's our muscularis externa, those 3 layers, the oblique, the circular, and the longitudinal. Our final layer on the outside, it does have a loose connective tissue along here, similar to the esophagus, but we're going to add on the very outside of the stomach, what we didn't see in the esophagus, a single layer of epithelial cells, simple squamous cells. This is the mesothelium, mesothelial layer on the very outside. So let's go ahead and label all these parts here. We've already mentioned that we have the epithelium. It's mostly a columnar epithelium. Then we have the lamina propria. That is a loose connective tissue with lots of lymphocytes and vessels and so forth. Then we have the muscularis mucosa. So those 3 things make up the mucosa of the stomach. The next layer here is our dense irregular connective tissue, the submucosal layer. Next we have our oblique layer, our circular layer, and our longitudinal layer. Of muscularis externa. Muscularis externa. Finally, we have this layer of loose connective tissue and the mesothelium. That together makes up a serosa. Let's go ahead and try to label this. That's the loose connective tissue. And that's mesothelium. And that's what we call, that membrane we call a serosa. the serosal membrane. So that's the layering we see on the stomach wall, layering of the stomach wall. All right, let's go back and talk about the formation of pepsin again. Remember that pepsinogen is produced by chief cells in your gastric gland. So we have this precursor to an active enzyme produced down deep in the gland. As it moves up through the gland, it comes in contact with hydrochloric acid. The hydrochloric acid produced by the parietal cells that are further up in the gland. So the parietal cells producing hydrochloric acid cause that pepsinogen to be converted into this active enzyme called pepsin. Pepsin, the active form of it, causes proteins to be broken down into smaller chains called peptides, shorter chains of amino acids that make up the peptides. So that's what's going on in your stomach enzymatically. We also still have some action possibly of the carbohydrate digesting enzymes that came from our saliva, but mainly we're looking at this kind of chemical digestion in your stomach. And of course your stomach has a very active role in mixing and churning that food around. We're all familiar with the stomach movements. So a lot of contracting and mixing, muscular mechanical action in your stomach, as well as this chemical breakdown of proteins into peptides.